Did women have a revolution? Now, in this French Revolution, was there any revolution in case of women? Was there any change in the lives of women? Let us see in this topic. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. So, what happened? From the very beginning, women were actually the active participants in the events, and all these events were responsible for the important changes in French society. What did women hope? Women hoped that their involvement, their participation would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Means if they participate, then government will do something to improve their lives. Most women of the third estate had to work for a living. Third estate, the group which had the burden of payment of taxes, they had to work for a living. The women from this estate, they had to actually work for a living, for earning money. They worked as seamstresses or laundresses, sold flowers, fruits and vegetables at the market, or were employed as domestic servants in the houses of prosperous people. What are the different types of work women did in France? They worked as seamstresses. Seamstresses means women who sew on a sewing machine. Sewing machine on which cloths are stitched. So women who worked on sewing machines, they were called seamstresses. Laundresses, we know women working in a laundry. They also sold flowers, fruits, vegetables at the market, or were employed as domestic servants in the houses of prosperous people, in the houses of rich people. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Women were deprived of education. They did not get the right to educate themselves. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent, after which their families arranged a marriage for them. Who could study in a convent? Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent. Working women had also to care for their families, that is, cook, fetch water, queue up for bread, and look after the children. What other additional work did the working women do? They took care of their families, they cooked, they fetched water, they brought water, and they also waited for a long time to buy the bread, and they also looked after their children. Their wages were lower than those of men. The wages as compared to men were less in case of women. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. Now, somewhere women were not happy with their lives. They wanted to discuss, and so for this they started their own separate political clubs and newspapers. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. How many women's clubs came up? How many women's clubs were formed? About 60. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. One of their main demands was that women enjoy the same political rights as men, which was the famous political club formed by the women in French society, the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. And what was their main demand? Their main demand was that women enjoy the same political rights as men. The political rights of men and women should be same. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. According to the Constitution of 1791, women were only the passive citizens, they were not the active citizens. This disappointed the women, they were not happy. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political office. What did they demand for? They wanted to vote, they wanted to get elected to the assembly, and they also wanted to hold political office. Only then they felt would their interests be represented in the new government. In the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce laws that helped improve the lives of women. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. This was the first thing that the revolutionary government did to improve the lives of women. They created state schools, they started new schools, and schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. What was the second thing that the revolutionary government did? Fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. Women had the right to speak if they were forced to marry against their will. Marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely, and registered under civil law. Now, marriage was to be a contract. Entered into freely means both men and women had the right to take their own decision freely. They were not supposed to be pressurized by their parents, and it was the marriage contract was registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for by both women and men. What was made legal? Divorce was made legal, and application for the divorce could be given by both men and women. Even women, if they don't want to stay with their husband, they could apply for the divorce. They could stay away from the husband. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists or run small businesses to earn a livelihood, to earn proper money. They could now train themselves for jobs. They could become artists or run small businesses and earn profits. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. During the reign of terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Women's struggle for political rights continued. What happened during the reign of terror? During the reign of terror, what laws were passed? The laws included the order to close the women's clubs and ban their political activities. They were not supposed to meet at the clubs. They were not supposed to discuss or do any activity. Many prominent women, the active women of the different clubs, were arrested and number of them executed, number of them killed. Women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. Now, this was the impact that even throughout the world in different countries, women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What happened during the late 19th and early 20th centuries? The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement. What is meant by suffrage? The right to vote. So, an international movement, an international activity was actually completed to achieve, to get the freedom for the women to vote. The example of the political activities of French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. When did women in France got the right to vote? In 1946. The abolition of slavery. What is meant by slavery? Slavery is poor people especially. Poor people are made to work by the rich people. They are treated badly. They are not given good food. A lot of work is done by these poor people. They are exploited. And the businessmen, the rich people who get the work done, they get the profit, and very little money is given to the slaves. The slaves had to leave their houses, their families, their children, and come and stay with the rich people. So abolition of slavery means this system of slavery in which poor people were made to work hard and they were exploited. This system of slavery was abolished. How was it abolished? Let us see. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. French colonies means France went out of the French people, the French invaders went out of France and they developed their own colonies in other parts of the world. Now these colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe and Saint Domingo were important supplies of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. These were the colonies. And here, if all these commodities like tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee, these four things were like exploited, they were like traded, they were like sold by these French traders. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work. Now, reluctance means they were not ready. Reluctance means the readiness was not there of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. Now here actually these colonies, Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe and Saint Domingo, these colonies had plantations of tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. These plantations, they were planted, they were developed and the crops were sold, traded and profit was earned. But people were not ready, Europeans were not ready, they were reluctant to go and work in these distant means far away places. These places were far from their homes. Now what was an idea to solve this problem? So this problem was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa and Americas. Now what was done? Triangular slave trade. Slave trade means actually rich people, they traded the slaves. They traded like generally we trade goods and services, but this time these rich people traded means supplied people to work in these plantations of tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast where they bought slaves from local chieftains. Now French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux, Nantes to African coast. They went to the African coast to get the slaves. And who gave them the slaves? Who provided the slaves? Who sold them the slaves? Local chieftains of Africa, local dealer of Africa. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. See what was the condition of these slaves while they were brought to the Atlantic, brought through the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean. They were branded and shackled. They were also packed tightly into the ships for how many months? 3 months. Here shackled means they were not allowed, the slaves were not allowed to live freely. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo. Now as they got these slaves from the Africa, it was possible for them to meet the growing demand for these products. So slaves worked hard, they worked on the plantations, they got the crops of sugar, coffee, indigo, and the trade was of profit. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Very important sentence. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity. These two ports became economically prosper. They became important places of business, and this was owed, like the credit goes to the flourishing slave trade. Flourishing means improving, developing on a very good scale. Slave trade that was improving. Slaves were brought very easily from the African countries. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. This system of slavery was not criticized on a large scale. There was little criticism. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. Now, what was the important debate held in National Assembly? Whether the rights of man should be given to the people in the colonies also. But it did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. What happened? This debate, this idea of giving rights of man to the French colonies outside France was not given any importance. This law was not passed. What was the fear? Fear of opposition from businessmen. Why will businessmen oppose? Because they were getting income from slave trade. Their business depended on slave trade. It was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. But what happened? In 1794, a law was made to free all the slaves in the French overseas possessions. This, however, turned out to be a short-term measure. 10 years later, Napoleon introduced slavery. Again, after 10 years, this freedom existed only for 10 years, and after that Napoleon again reintroduced slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interests. What did plantation owners understand? Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes. Plantation owners wanted the freedom to enslave African Negroes, to make the African Negroes work as slaves in pursuit of their economic interests, for their own economic interests, for their own freedom, for their own earning of profit. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. The revolution and everyday life. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women and children. Now see, as the new ideas came up, voting rights, rights of women, freedom of slaves, all these new ideas, They brought a change. They brought a revolution. And now, because of the revolution, how was the everyday life affected? Let us see. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. The idea of equality and liberty were to be practiced on everyday basis. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. What is meant by censorship? Censorship is, like for example, we see very common example in some movies when somebody is shown smoking a cigar, a note comes down. Cigarette smoking is injurious to health. Actually, such things which are not good for the society. Now, smoking is not a good activity. It should not be shown in the movies. But even if it is showed, a note comes down. So this is done by the censor board. Like for example, one more example, what should be published in the newspaper? It is also there in the hands of the censor board. It was there in the hands of the censor board in those days. So what was the abolition of censorship? In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, books, newspapers, plays could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now only the king can pass, can approve, can give permission what to write in the books, what to publish in the newspapers, and what plays should be arranged or conducted. So see, this was the censorship by the king. If somebody is to express his or her ideas in opposition to the king, something wrong about the king, then the king would stop. Now the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Okay, what was declared? What was there in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen? Freedom of speech. People are free to speak and express, and this was a natural right, natural by birth. As we are born, if we don't like anything, we can speak about it. We can express our ideas, our opinions. So this was a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books and printed pictures flooded the towns of France, from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. So what happened? Censorship was removed, censorship was abolished. Now people can express their views very nicely, very freely, with the help of newspapers, pamphlets, books and printed pictures. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. So what happened? All the current events taking place in France, they were described, discussed. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. What can be expressed? Opposing views of events. Whatever happens, whatever event takes place, people can now express their views in opposition to that event. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Each side, each and every portion of the society, they tried to convince the others of its position. Like they wanted to say that how they are right through the medium of print. Plays, songs and festive processions attracted large numbers of people. Plays, songs and festive processions, these cultural activities, they attracted people, started watching. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in text which only a handful of educated people could read. Now, because the ideas of liberty or justice were written into big books, they could be only read. Who can read these books? Only the educated people can read. But if these ideas are brought in the form of plays, songs and festive processions, then people, even simple man, uneducated people, poor people can understand what is meant by right, what is a natural right for them. Do they have the freedom to speak freely? Do they have the freedom to express themselves? Conclusion. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. What did he do? He started conquering neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms. He brought down the king and he created his own kingdom, and he placed his family members at these places. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. What was his role? His was a role of a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. What is the thing that he did? What did he introduce? He introduced many laws, such as one was the protection of private property. Like if you own something, if you have your own house, if you own your land, it can be protected and can be registered. And a uniform system of weights and measures, like different measures like kg, liter, kilometer. All these, first they were not uniformly used. Different weights and measures were used in different places. So all this was developed into one uniform system of weights and measures, and only that was to be used. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. Earlier, he was a very good liberator. He wanted to bring freedom for the people, but soon the Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. But later on, Napoleonic armies, they acted as an invading force. They came to capture. He was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left. What had an impact on people? Many of his measures, many of Napoleon's measures, ideas, methods, steps that he carried, the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws, to other parts. He was actually a medium of transfer of these ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe. And this had an impact on people. People learnt what ideas can revolutionize their life, what ideas can bring a change in their life, which ideas can give them freedom, that is liberty. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. What was the important legacy of the French Revolution? The ideas of liberty and democratic rights. What is meant by legacy? Legacy is the gift that was left after the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, what was gained by the whole world? The whole world gained the ideas of liberty and democratic rights. Democratic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of right to vote, and the ideas of liberty means the ideas of freedom. This spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems, these ideas spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. Colonized peoples reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. Colonized peoples reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. colonized peoples, they gained the ideas and they started working for the idea of freedom. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy from India. These two leaders, these two were the names who they responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. They were the people who brought these ideas to their own country, India.